Good evening, and welcome to the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater and the Simon Family JCC's Virginia Festival of Jewish Film, presented by Patricia and Avraham Ashkenazi and Alma and Howard Lederberg. We have an exciting evening ahead and two special guests. We'll be discussing the mouthwatering film Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, which I hope you've had a chance to enjoy. My name is Ann Fleeter, and I'm co-chair, along with Debbie Fink, of this year's film festival. Before we begin, a few programming notes. Tonight's event is brought to you in webinar format, so you will be muted throughout the program and you will not be able to see other attendees. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible with time permitting. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Betsy DiJulio received her BA in philosophy from the University of Southern Mississippi, an MA in art history from Vanderbilt University, and an educational specialist graduate degree in curriculum instruction from the George Washington University. In addition, Ms. DiJulio is an award-winning artist and national board-certified high school art teacher at Norfolk Academy, an adjunct professor in art history and appreciation at Tidewater Community College, a cookbook author, a blogger, and a widely published freelance writer, columnist on topics of art, art education, home and garden design, food, eco issues, artisanal businesses, and day hiking. Her first cookbook, The Blooming Platter, A Harvest of Seasonal Vegan Recipes, was published by Vegan Heritage Press. This longtime vegetarian turned vegan is a lifetime cooking, walking, and art enthusiast, a one-time caterer and noted museum educator, an occasional cooking instructor, and an all-the-time animal lover and devoted teacher. Deborah Krohn is an associate professor and the chair of academic programs and the coordinator for history and theory of museums at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City. She teaches Italian Renaissance decorative arts and cultural history. She holds a BA and an MA from Princeton University and a PhD from Harvard University. Her fellowships include a Fulbright to Italy, the American Association of University Women, and the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies at Columbia University. She has collaborated on exhibitions at the Bard Graduate Center and New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Ms. Krohn is currently preparing an exhibition and accompanying catalog titled Staging the Table in Early Modern Europe. If you have seen the film, you will recall she served as Yotam Ottolenghi's academic guide and food historian. The origin of this community conversation began with the collaboration between the Virginia Festival of Jewish Film and the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, or MoCA. How prescient of us to foresee that MoCA would be showing an exhibition on food at the same time that the film festival would also be showing a film about food. However, if we dig deeper, we realize that while the subject of food is similar, many aspects of the translation of food into film versus visual art can be very different. So let's have that discussion and start with a few questions for Deborah and Betsy. First of all, welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
I'm Laura Gabbert. I'm the director of Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, and we're so happy to have you join us.
And I'm Yotam Ottolenghi, as in Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles. And it's a joy to have you with us and to be watching the film. Laura and I have been working on this film for quite a while. It was a complete joy, wasn't it, Laura, to kind of go and discover first Versailles, then how we're going to translate all these amazing achievements, technological achievements at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And you were following me with a camera, which was both exciting and occasionally stressful, but I think we've got some amazing cakes there.
Yeah, there was a lot to follow because in addition to you, we had our 5 other pastry chefs that were so wonderful. And I just want to say when this idea first came to me, I jumped at it because I heard Yotam's name and I thought, yes, anything with Yotam will give it this sort of depth and beauty. And then I loved the idea, as Yotam, you were saying, this idea of the intersection of food and art, food and culture, food and history, which I feel like we were so fortunate to capture when we made this film together.
Yeah, and you followed the process of how would I put it? Me getting myself informed about a subject that I really had very little knowledge about through books and conversations with, and I think Versailles came to life through this process because. We really, first of all, we went to Versailles. We literally had the palace to ourselves for a whole 3 hours, very early one morning. But also afterwards, through the conversations that I was having with the pastry chefs, with the amazing pastry chefs that made those cakes, the whole place came to a completely new life. And I thought, like in this case, as in other cases where you combine food and history, we discovered that through flavor, you can really get a particular perspective on a historical period. And this was about flavor, but it was also about the architecture of Versailles, the architectures of the cake and the architectures of the gardens of Versailles, all kind of intermingling. And in the end, it just made total sense.
Yeah, culminating in that event, which you will see on screen, where the sort of culmination of all of the pastry chefs' work come together. And then I also love, this idea, Yotam, that you really wanted to bring to it, that in a way we're sort of retelling the rise and fall of Versailles as all of the cakes are kind of demolished and eaten and destroyed at the end.
Well, I think for me, it was so clear that there is something, there is clear decadence to the whole, to the Versailles era that we know so well, but there's also a decadence that involved in making patisserie, and those two things were almost shouting at me, this connection has to be made. So the idea that you create something, bring it to a climax, and then devour it is something that reflects both Versailles, the era that has gone, and patisserie making. You make so much effort to create something so elaborate and decadent, and then it's kind of gone within a few minutes. And that's captured, I think, really well at the end of the film, how the destruction of the cakes as it parallels with the destruction of Versailles. Yeah, enjoy the film. Bake some cakes from either myself or the other pastry chefs, if you can, just to bring a little bit of the taste of Versailles into your homes.
Okay, so now with the questions. Artists and chefs have worked in collaboration with others and in an environment that neither is used to. Can you tell us about how that worked? Deborah, let's start with you. I know it was tough on these world-renowned pastry chefs to arrive with only 2 days to create their masterpieces at the Met and have to figure out how to succeed in a completely new space. How were these challenges met?
Yeah, so hello everybody, good evening. I would say they were met because people planned ahead. There was a lot of advanced planning. They really understood that this was a performance, not, I guess for a chef, every night in the kitchen is a performance if they're cooking at a restaurant. But I think for something that was at the Met, that was an unusual situation, it really was getting ready, and they wanted it to go well. They knew that a lot was resting on it. And I think, the event at the Met was planned before the movie was planned. So the movie sort of came not at the last minute, but certainly it was an afterthought in a way. And so for the chefs, I think they probably thought, not only is this a really fun project, and we get to meet Ottolenghi and we get to go to the Met and to New York, but it's going to be immortalized in a film. And so I think they planned, and they had to have everything ready, and they probably tested it out. They probably tried different ways of doing it beforehand, like anybody you know, you don't make a new dish when you're having an important person to your home for dinner, right? You make something you've made a million times and you know how it turns out. So I think that's probably how they prepared.
Okay, great. Sometimes I do make a new dish, but it's probably with people that are going to be completely honest with me. So,
Right.
Anyhow.
Close friends, it's okay, but people
Yeah.
you're trying to impress, you're not going to risk it, right?
So Betsy, I'll ask the same question with a different angle. New space, curators with one vision and perhaps you with another, working with new materials and then learning from a food expert whose livelihood was your inspiration. How were you able to succeed?
I think Deborah hit on the main ingredient here, to make a bad pun, and that was a lot of planning. And I think I also, just from my perspective, there's 11 other artists in the show, but from my perspective, I think I overestimated how small my work was going to look in the space, and it turned out to fill the space differently than I'd imagined. And so I had a plan A and a plan B for the arrangement of it. And I ended up liking plan B so much better. It almost looked like an altar the way it ended up installed. But you're right. I think there's often, you think you're all on the same page, and yet you don't really know till it all comes together. And I jokingly call the two curators good cop and bad cop, because I had one saying, challenge yourself, and I had another saying, keep it focused. And so I was like, wait a minute, do I be expansive here, or do I be in more of a contraction mode? And so that was sort of an interesting but really fun and engaging kind of tightrope to walk, I would say. But so much support from Mocha.
Awesome.
And yeah.
That's terrific. Thank you. So Deborah, tell us a little bit about what the inspirations were for these chefs. Did they end up traveling to Versailles? Did they use the internet? And did they need Yotam or the Met's approval? What was your role in the process? And was there ever a time where two chefs overlapped and they had to kind of figure out a way to have them redo what they were thinking so there wasn't so much of an overlap?
Yeah, so as far as the chefs, Yotam chose the chefs. And as you saw in the film, he is looking at websites and Instagram, and he finds these chefs kind of like they come from all different places. And I don't know whether he knew of them before starting to look for people for the show, but I think the idea was really his. I didn't have any role in choosing the chefs at all. My role was really to give him some historical background advice. And as a historian, I was asked sort of what would the food have been like at Versailles, and what sort of ingredients, what cookbooks would, and I gave him all this information. And what I realized after a certain moment was he really wasn't interested in this sort of like a historical recreation. That wasn't the point at all. But I think it was some kind of inspiration in terms of what the history was. And I don't know, I think the chefs really didn't meet each other beforehand. They didn't know what the other ones were doing. I think that it was just kind of random. I mean, he must have coordinated what the projects were so they wouldn't overlap, but they're so creative and so different that I don't think that was ever really going to be a problem.
And I think he also liked the idea that they came from different parts of the world.
Right. I mean, they were really sort of riffing on the idea of luxury and of using ingredients in an innovative way. And what Versailles was because of the wealth of the French monarchy, they really had everything at their disposal. They could do whatever they wanted. So that sort of decadence of, a fountain of booze, that kind of thing, that was just, normal people wouldn't think of using ingredients in that way because they wouldn't be able to afford it. So there was this kind of luxury and excess that I think Yotam, I think, must have communicated to the chefs, do something outrageous, push yourselves to the limit, push the envelope.
So you don't have a fountain of booze on your patio?
I have a glass of wine, that's like
right on.
That's what this is not. I don't think anyone would consider this a fountain. What can I say?
Fair enough. Betsy, so how did your mind work? Were you ever overwhelmed? And was there any one person who helped you to see your artistry more clearly?
There were so many people, really, but can I just kind of riff off of something that Deborah said, which was, I think what made this work was that the curators at MoCA so skillfully selected, instead of chefs, they selected artists, and they made sure in their selections that there wasn't going to be uncomfortable overlap, and that there was going to be enough difference among the artists, and then the artists paired with their food experts was going to provide enough diversity and yet enough cohesion that the show hung together, again, a bad pun, but hung together really beautifully, and offered a lot of challenge to viewers, but also to the chefs. So yes, I was overwhelmed from start to finish. But I feel like MoCA did such a beautiful job of really being as hands-off as you wanted them to be, but also as supportive as you needed for them to be. They just walked that line beautifully. And, you know, so Heather and Allison were the two curators that I worked with, that we all worked with. And then Elliot Hicks is the preparator. He was remarkable in the kinds of resources he brought to the table. I needed something made out of plexiglass. And during the pandemic, plexiglass has been really hard to get, but he helped me design what I needed and helped me procure that. So he was amazing. And then John Runner has got a business. He's a professor, but he's got a business in Newport News that's called Print. And it's this beautiful print studio that you can either rent from him or he can sort of tutor you basically in, and that's what I had him do. So without him, a huge and probably the foundational part of my installation would have never happened. He was remarkable. We met about 3 times and, you know, did some hard labor, but it was too much fun to learn how to do blind embossings from him.
Well, it's fun as an artist to be able to still continue to learn and to grow. And
Oh,
it's like
absolutely.
that's what happened. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Good for you. Let's see. This one's a little more complex, but how do artists and chefs tell their stories through their work? Like Deborah, what do ingredients and presentations have to say about the chef? And you don't necessarily have to talk about just this movie, because I know so much of what you do is historical, and we're trying to tie in the movie and the exhibition, but tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess the chefs often are the chefs that have written books, both in the past and in the present, usually have a lot of patronage. You know, they have people that they have an audience who they're cooking for, so they have like specific reasons why they make certain dishes, and that was the case for some of the historical work I've done, that these were chefs who worked for the Pope or for an important an elector or a duke or a king, somebody like that. And the only reason that we have the books is because the patron generally helped finance the publication, and you know, recipes were not always written down in the past. They were transferred orally, and the idea of having actually a book that people would go to look at recipes was kind of unusual, and really I think still to this day many people cook because they get a recipe from a friend or from a family member. It's not always a kind of text to practice situation. So the stories that the chefs tell, I think, you know, now we have a much closer relationship, and I think some of the chefs that we follow on Instagram and on other social media gives us a much better sense of the stories that chefs are telling, whereas historically I think that there were a lot of formal constraints that it didn't enable them to really tell their stories, I would say.
Like, did the chefs have any, were they visible at all? Did they have a relationship with the king and the queen?
Yeah, they did. The people who wrote the cookbooks did, right? So the people whose names we know and whose books we have absolutely did. The chefs were important because it was a big security issue, having the kings and the popes and the dukes and all that. Somebody had to make sure that what they were being fed was safe. And so the chefs had to be completely trustworthy, and they were pretty high up in the hierarchy of the servants, if we put it that way, the people who were working to staff these palaces and these large households. So the chefs were not, they definitely were known, their names were known, and they had a following. They were, people would definitely, in the same way that now you might have a friend who has, you know, that they're a great cook, or maybe they have a personal chef, and you know that an invitation to their home will always be delicious. I think that was the case throughout history, for sure.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So Betsy, for an artist beyond the didactics on the walls, how are you able to communicate with your audience through your work?
I think really all contemporary artists do this, and they work with symbol and metaphor. Well, I should also say that Jeremy Bates' film was amazing, and he interviewed all of the artists, and that plays in the gallery all the time. So visitors can access that, and it's been on social media, clips from it. So there's been a lot of that kind of thing. But I think symbol and metaphor, and you know, I struggle sometimes with the difference between the two of them. But I think symbol, you know, both, or something that stands for something else, right? But I think symbol is generally understood by the culture to mean what it means, whereas metaphor is more artist specific, and it often gets at a particular quality of the thing being symbolized. And I think that's kind of the difference between symbol and metaphor. And I think all of the artists in the show used varying degrees of that. I know I did. And also contemporary artists use their materials metaphorically. And so in my case, that was very much the way I communicated. So for instance, a blind embossing is really just an image impressed into paper, but it has this amazing ability to talk about both presence and absence at the same time, because it's just a relief impression into the paper. And I needed that for what I was talking about with the kinds of soils. And then the installation part of my piece was, I actually used dried corn in test tubes, and I used dried beans and legumes in other test tubes to talk about two different ideas about farming. And so the material itself communicated part of the idea, and the colors of those materials. I wanted the corn to all be very uniform, and I wanted the beans and legumes to be the spectrum of colors, to talk about a different kind of verdancy. And then at Kevin's farm, Kevin Jameson was my food expert. He uses charcoal in the soil to amend it, and so my drawings of crops were actually done with charcoal. And so the medium is the message. The charcoal was actually telling part of the story, I would say.
I also think it's fascinating in your work of art, and you can explain it because you put side by side what was actually side by side in the field. Can you elaborate on that a little bit so people, because unfortunately we didn't think about this. I should have had an image of your work, but you know what? This will inspire people to go to MoCA and see the exhibition for themselves. So just give them sort of a taste of what we're talking about.
No pun intended, yet again, a taste. Here we go. So just really briefly, because the show is not about me, it's about all 12 of us, but it starts, it's like a flow chart, and it starts with the soil at the bottom. And then above that is the drawings of the crops that grow out of the soil. And then above that is the yield that comes from the crops. And so that's the test tubes with the dried materials in them. And then the paintings that are how our food supply and where our food comes from and how it's farmed affects communities. And so it's kind of just a flowchart from the ground up. I mean, it really starts with the soil. That was the thing that Kevin told me in our very first conversation. It all starts with the soil. And so I built from the soil up.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that one.
Of course.
So this is kind of interesting. Obviously, Deborah, first start with you. There's a parallel between the opulence and rise and fall of Versailles and the decadence and creation and destruction of these beautiful cakes, because it's for one evening or maybe it's 2 evenings. And they spend all this time creating this delectable, edible artwork, and it's gone in a moment. And obviously, it parallels history. So I guess it's a part of the bigger narrative where art and food become a metaphor for excess and power and authority. Can you elaborate on this? And was it intentional? I think that's kind of obvious, but.
So, when the movie was made, it was before the pandemic. And when the event was planned, it was well before the pandemic. I guess it happened in 2018. And so it was planned in 2017. And I don't think anybody could have imagined what was going to happen. I mean, none of us could have imagined what was going to happen. So at Versailles, there's definitely a narrative about the excess of the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution that comes in the 1780s and culminating with what we know as the revolution in 1789, and then a whole completely regime change in France. But to say that any one event precipitated the revolution is obviously simplistic. And I think the culture of excess that was part of not only of Versailles, but of the French upper class in general was what, one thing that precipitated the revolution. Obviously there were deep economic problems and bread riots, and okay, I'm not going to give a whole lecture about the French Revolution here, but it's a history that's pretty well known. So I think that when the filmmakers were when all of the footage that they shot, and I can't speak for them, I wasn't there, but when they were sort of cutting the movie, and it was, I think some of it, the pandemic might have just started. It was supposed to be the first viewing was supposed to be at the Tribeca Film Festival in April of 2020, so sort of in the middle of the pandemic. So I honestly, that would be a question for them, for Laura, really, and Steve. Did they kind of go back and change the narrative at the end of the movie to kind of bring it into some kind of focus and a comparison with on the other hand, I don't think anybody is arguing that the pandemic was a scourge, and that somehow excesses in culture led to if anything, yes, globalism in general, and okay, whatever, all of that stuff. But I don't think the parallel really is not really explicit for what's happening now. I think for Versailles, yes, I mean, it's a way to look at it. The exhibition was really just about the idea of visitors, diplomatic visitors coming to Versailles. So the idea of sort of the proleptic idea of destruction wasn't really part of the exhibition. But I think because the food is so ephemeral, and food in general is ephemeral, and that's why it's not part of exhibitions normally, right? It's normally something that it comes and goes, it's over. It's hard to kind of fix it and to make it into something that's an object in an exhibition. So I think a lot of these things, we see them through the lenses of our times, and it's hard to dissociate.
Well, it's funny that you talk about bread riots, because I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was trying to make bread and nobody could get yeast.
Right. Right. Well, it's still the case now. Whenever I see yeast in the supermarket, I think, should I buy all of that?
Yes.
And then I think, no, that's ridiculous, but
no, buy it all, and then you can, sell it for more.
Or it'll just go bad and you'll throw it away. So, I mean, that's the other option.
Okay, so Betsy, how do you see your work or any other work in the Nourish exhibition going beyond what's obvious to the eye, but maybe not so obvious to the emotion of the piece?
There's a couple of great examples, and there's many great examples in the show, but there's a couple I'd love to talk about just briefly. And one is Carl Medley's, and he was paired with, I believe the organization is called Food Rescue, and it's a chapter here that's run by a teenage girl and people that she doesn't necessarily know. She kind of puts out calls for volunteers, and they take food that would be wasted from restaurants and they divert it and are able to give it away to kind of a drive-up situation. But at any rate, he was so inspired by her. She was his partner, and he really wanted to do something that spoke to how people can make things happen when they join together. That sounds cliche, and the way I'm saying it, it isn't at all in what he's doing and what she's doing. But the idea that you want to be big, part of something bigger than yourself. So I think his project was fascinating. It was called Just Try, and it's this really big painting. And he invited 4 other artists to come in succession and paint for up to 4 hours, I believe, whatever they wanted on top of what he had started. And so each artist added a layer on top of the layer before, and they had that finite amount of time. And so it was a collaboration, and yet there was no coordination. It was just kind of in the moment. And the painting is striking and gorgeous and rich and fragmented and cohesive and exciting. And I just think it's just this amazing, I think that it's just this amazing metaphor for collaboration, and yet you wouldn't necessarily know it by looking at it. It could have been the work of just one artist. So I think that's one of the really hidden kind of narratives that's exciting in the show. And like I said, there's many. And then another would be Clayton Singleton's.
Wait, can I interject 1 second?
Sure.
Remind people too that with that narrative you're talking about,
Oh, there's a film.
yes, there's a video, and
Yes.
it's wonderful because you get to see the progression from start to finish, and so it's a wonderful.
And taking the metaphor even further was the fact that Carl knew of those artists, but he didn't know them. And so sort of like his partner was using volunteers that she didn't necessarily know to make this amazing thing happen in the community. He was doing the same thing with this painting. But the other one is Clayton Singleton, and his painting is another huge one, hangs near Carl's, and it's called Far From Manna, and the manna from heaven idea. And basically, he followed his sister and her partner on a trip to a grocery store, and they have to get there. It's very slow and very long, and they have to go by bus. And so his painting is an image of the two of them sitting on this bus with their bags of food next to them, and they don't have a lot of bags of food, so they have to go this far and spend this much time just to get a small amount of groceries. But what's hidden in that painting is also fascinating. And so he has some of the patterning in the background is the slave trade routes, and it's just kind of these lines, but it is definitely a map. If you look closely, you'll see it. And then overlaid on top of that, there are just some quotes that he wrote by hand of what people said just in the process of his research. And so I think one of the kind of postmodern ideas or contemporary ideas in art is this layering and this kind of juxtaposition that happens, and then the meaning that arises out of that. So at any rate, that's all buried in there too. You can see parts of it. And then he uses Adinkra symbols, which are from West Africa, Ghana, and they sort of just hover in the background. And I looked up what some of them were, and some of them mean democracy, another means abundance, and another means the grace of God. So they're very positive kinds of symbols. But his whole message is just about food deserts, basically, and what a hardship it is for people who are redlined in their own communities to have to just procure something as basic as groceries.
Yeah, it's a beautiful painting too.
It is. It is. All of his work is.
I am going to go with a question from the audience, just so it's not premeditated. We have a question that says, within the broad subject of food, what was specifically asked of participating chefs in New York and artists at MoCA for these exhibits? For example, was it about the chef or artist's specialty, or their most challenging or elaborate foods to make/present, or about food representatives of Versailles? What was the specific theme? Do you want me to repeat that?
No, it's okay.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer. Should I start?
Sure.
The short answer is no. The chefs really came up with ideas themselves based on their inspiration. There are two of them. Gaia Oliveira, her inspiration was, that she did that beautiful chocolate sun sun sculpture, and that was because of, Louis the 14th was the Sun King. And I think she was inspired in terms of the flavors by, orange and honey and things that were definitely part of the palette of Versailles. And then Janice Wong from Singapore, her kind of garden that was made out of all of this, just like an amazing sort of flat garden sculpture made out of different kinds of chocolate and other types of pastry. I mean, that, again, they were sort of inspired by Versailles, but not, there was no directive. I don't think Tom said, you have to use certain ingredients or you have to make it a certain shape, or I think the idea was that these were creative people and that their inspiration was going to be from something that was very unique, and that's what was make it interesting and exciting.
I'm just curious, did he ever want to be a participant? Do you know?
Say. I don't know. I think he was asked to kind of curate it.
Okay.
And so it wasn't something that in his cooking now, he was trained as a pastry chef, and he says that in the movie, but I think now he does a lot of, he develops a lot of other recipes, and certainly not all pastry, and certainly not exclusively French pastry. As I'm sure you all know that his cookbooks often are very much inspired by food of the Middle East, of Israel, Palestine, parts of the world that are very, very different from Versailles, for sure. So right. I don't think that that was part of the story at any point.
Okay, Betsy, do you need me to repeat it?
No, I don't think so. I'm just going to rip off of Deborah again. Yeah, I think that in the case of Mocha, the curators were very careful to choose artists that had very definite voices and very definite careers and bodies of work that had been developed over time. And they had us recommend food experts that we would be interested in working in, but then they made the ultimate match. But then they stepped back. So like Deborah said, they didn't give us a directive. What they wanted was for all of the work that was produced to be, I would say, kind of a mashup or a hybrid of inspiration from the person we were paired with, and then just our own concerns as an artist, including concerns about food. But in that way, sort of bring the two together. But we were never told what we needed to do, what we had to do. It was really exciting, but also overwhelming, to find a little piece that you wanted to expand on it. I remember seeing an interview with Annie Leibovitz at one time, and she said, basically what artists are doing is something very simple. It's a really defined small area that they want to investigate. And after that, a lot of other stuff gets layered on top of it. But what the artist is doing is pretty straightforward. And we had to find that straightforward aspect that we wanted to work with.
Well, I must share with the audience that when Betsy was first called by the curators, she's so multi-talented that she thought she was being called to be the food expert. So she could have worn both hats. She could have helped herself.
The joke was on me.
Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking of something kind of fun. And Deborah, I want to ask you, were you able to taste everything? And if you were, what was your favorite?
Yeah, after it was over, we got to circulate with the audience and taste the sweets. I think my favorite was, there were these beautiful swans made out of choux pastry that Dominique Ansel made, and it was so beautiful to have these this like kind of gaggle of swans, whatever the term is there, and they were so delicate and delicious. So that they were my favorite. The chocolate dessert, the cake was really good too. The cake that was Dinara's cake was really delicious.
Did you feel guilty eating the head of the swan?
I got over it.
Okay, so I have other questions too. Deborah and Betsy, what drew you personally personally to the study of art history and food? And what are you working on at this time?
Well, Betsy, why don't you go first, since I've been going first with all the other ones.
No, you go first. Let's just keep this going.
I think you both need a little bit of time to think. Is that what
Okay.
it is?
No.
Well, I was interested in just the relationship between culture and society, and what people, how art expressions of, in not only in paintings, but especially in objects like furniture and jewelry and textiles and all of that. That's what really got me interested. It really is a form of sort of material history and cultural history. That's how I got interested in art history. And what was the other part of the question? Sorry. Wait, you're muted.
Why don't you talk about what you're working on now?
Oh, right. Okay. So now, besides my job, which is, teaching and being the chair of the department and going to a lot of Zoom meetings, is I'm working on an exhibition that's about a group of printed books from the 17th and 18th centuries that teach people how to carve meat and slice fruit in exciting ways, and also how to fold napkins and make centerpieces out of folded textiles. And it sounds kind of like, really, but it was a huge genre of printed books that spread all over Europe, between France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, England, and Scandinavia. And I'm trying to bring together as many of these books as I can lay my hands on, and just open them to different pages and talk about these traditions of carving and folding, and talk about the books. A lot of it's about the history of books and the role of books and prints, print culture, as well as the knives and the cutlery and the linens that went into it. And that's going to be at the Bard Graduate Center in February of 2023. And I'm also writing a book about that. So that's my current work.
Exciting. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, Betsy, tell us what drew you to art history and what you're working on now.
Okay, so I'll just be real honest here. I had a degree in philosophy, much to my father's dismay. And I knew that with that and 25 cents, I could not even get a cup of coffee coming out of my undergraduate degree. So I knew I needed to go to graduate school. And I had this professor. I had started out as an art major, a studio art major, and I changed majors a number of times. Hotel and restaurant administration was another direction. I wanted to be a chef at one time. But at any rate, I figured out that they're always working when everyone else is playing, and I decided that probably wasn't for me. But at any rate, I had this professor that told me in one of my studio classes that I had some talent, but I would never do anything with it. And so we studio students had to also take art history courses, and I was sailing through those and loved them and was passionate about them. And I was struggling in the studio courses. I just didn't feel like I was quite where I needed to be. So when I was casting around for what I would do after undergraduate school, I thought, I really love art history, and I feel that if you want, someone much smarter than me said, if you want to understand a society, look at the art that's being made. And so I decided that was the direction I wanted to go, and I did. Never have regretted it, and had a career in museum education first, and then from there went into teaching. So what I'm working on now, I'm in a new job, and so I'm still figuring that out, and I love it at Norfolk Academy. I was with the public schools for 16 years at another high school, but mostly I'm working on a wedding. That's going to be on May 15th, and I really am not doing anything terribly scholarly right now. I'm teaching my courses at Norfolk Academy. I'm teaching I teach the course at TCC, Tidewater Community College, and I, keep my freelance writing going and going and going. But mostly right now, I'm painting some little tiny paintings that are going to go in welcome baskets for our guests when they check into the hotel. 20 of them to be exact. So, keeping me out of the saloons.
Okay, I gotcha. Well, you know what's interesting? I think we can encapsulate it all by saying Deborah is our Renaissance woman and Betsy is our modern day woman. So, but with that said, I think we've had an amazing evening. I'm so sorry it was supposed to end at 45 minutes, but I think it means that we've all just really enjoyed ourselves and great questions from the community. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for a community conversation on Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, and really just delving into the minds of two wonderful women. So we appreciate that. If you haven't seen the movie, there's still a few hours for you to catch the screening. Visit jewishva.org/film festival for more information and to register and to look at our upcoming films. One is If You're Not in the Obit, Eat Breakfast, and the other one is Keeping Up with the Steins, an oldie but a goodie. So thank you all and have a great evening.